Hi, you're listening to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show podcast. If you're studying the subject at GCSE, A-level, foundation, degree, or any other discipline, then this podcast could be of help to you. If you have a question for the show, then you can email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com, and one of the teachers, lecturers, examiners, or experts will answer your question for you. You can sponsor the show on the GoFundMe page and subscribe on all the usual podcast platforms. If you're going to class, going to the gym, or just chilling, put your headphones in and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. So do visit tutor2u.net/sociology for revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so on to the focus of this episode, which is understanding positivism and interpretivism. And I'm delighted to welcome Circe Newbold to the podcast. Hi, Circe.
Hi, Matthew.
Thanks for joining me. Just for the listeners, would you say a little bit about yourself? How long have you been teaching? I know you're an examiner as well.
Okay, yeah, sure. I've been teaching sociology for 20 years now to international students. So that's quite a different sort of take on it. And I've been a senior examiner for about 15 years as well.
Wow. And you contribute to textbooks and you've done some other work as well within sociology?
Yes, I have done a bit of contributing to textbooks also. Yep.
Brilliant. And so what I wanted to talk to you about today was there's many students around the country who just started new courses and they might have started on the terms of positivism and interpretivism. And I know quite a few students struggle with this. So we're going to start right from the very basics. So when you're introducing students to, let's start with positivism, how do you explain what it actually is?
Okay, I would normally start by trying to explain how positivists view the effect of society on behaviour. So because they see behaviour as being shaped by society, we don't really choose how we behave. Normally I try to link it to, like the effect of climate on plants or something else like that, and then link it to why they use the research methods that they do. So it starts with the way they view the relationship between society and individuals.
So they kind of take this focus of society shaping us rather than us shaping society, don't they?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and also almost that we can't control the way that society shapes us. It's happening outside of our control. The same way that rainfall affects plant growth and plants can't control whether or not it's raining. That's sort of how society impacts on us.
Yeah, and that's quite a good example because it's a scientific example. So many students get a bit confused by this as well. But what do we mean when we say like positivism is a more scientific approach than interpretivism?
Well, as you said, I think positivists want to use scientific methods. I think if they could, they would use experiments, but experiments have a lot of ethical issues and not very useful for studying society. So the best way they can study people is through structural kind of methods which try to test a hypothesis in a similar way to how scientists would test a hypothesis in a lab situation.
And so just for clarification, what sort of methods would we associate with positivists then? If they're taking that approach, what are the classic positivist methods?
So if it was a primary method, it would be some type of structured survey. And if it was a secondary method, it would be statistical analysis. And obviously the survey itself produces statistics, which can then be used to try and identify patterns of behaviour and ultimately test a hypothesis which they have created.
Excellent. And listeners will be aware those methods that you just mentioned are quantitative, so they tend to be numerical. So why do positivists tend to move towards the quantitative approach rather than qualitative?
I think it's because they stress so much importance on reliability, which in sociology doesn't really mean that we can trust the method. It means that it can be replicated. So any method that positivists use would be very standardized and very structured, this is really important to them so that they can repeat the experiment or the survey again and identify if the results are the same. Again, it is trying to, as far as possible, imitate the scientific method in the natural sciences.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So those of you listening who've done science lessons before, you will have started with a hypothesis, then tested the hypothesis, drawn towards a conclusion or evaluation. That's kind of the same process that positivists try to use in their own research, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, it is. I mean, they kind of, I suppose positivists would argue that they have observed some type of phenomena and then they have created a hypothesis. So I suppose the classic example would be Durkheim's study of suicide, where he observed patterns in suicide statistics. He then created a hypothesis and then tested it through statistical analysis. The idea being, I suppose, that scientists, natural scientists, observe naturally occurring phenomena in a very objective way, and then they create a theory and then test it. So I think the kind of observation process would come first, and then they would try to test the theory, if that makes sense.
Yeah, in much the same way as scientists would. And you just mentioned Durkheim, who's a functionalist. Which other perspectives or sociologists would adopt the positivist approach?
Well, I mean, interestingly, and maybe slightly contradictorily, it would also be Marxists. I think students often believe that Marxists and functionalists are polar opposites. And obviously, in the way that they see how society operates, they are, but they both take the view that society determines behaviour. Obviously, in the case of Marxists, it's capitalist society. So Marxist sociologists, although they would be critical of science in capitalist society, they would still use those very structured methods.
Yeah, it's kind of looking at society on a macro format, isn't it? Looking at on a large scale rather than a smaller scale that the interpretivists would.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, for Marxists, it is the system, it's the economic system that directly affects behaviour. So they would argue you don't need to look at what individuals are doing, let's say in a school, for example. You would just look at the education system and the way that education system determines the behaviour of the students.
So if Marxists are looking at kind of that macro approach, where does that link with feminism as well then? Would that be considered macro as well because it's looking at the system of patriarchy?
Well, I mean, feminists are tricky in terms of their research methods because, as you say, quite rightly, they do believe there is structural inequality. But feminists tend to prefer to use qualitative methods because they believe that structured methods are not very sensitive to women's needs or issues, and they are what they might call mainstream. So I feel like with feminists, there's a little bit of a contradiction there between the fact that they do see society as being structurally unequal, but they wouldn't really trust statistical data in terms of its validity, I guess.
Yeah. So sort of the true positivists, if you like, the pure positivists, are the early founding fathers of sociology. So Auguste Comte, and you mentioned Émile Durkheim as well.
Yeah. And I mean, although it's maybe not very interesting for students, if we look historically at when Comte and Durkheim were writing, it was in the context of France after the French Revolution, a very unstable time. And also at the time that science itself was becoming a very dominant academic discipline. So I think the need for certainty is why they liked reliable methods, and wanting to be taken seriously, we might say that still hasn't happened for us sociologists, was why they wanted to adopt the same sort of procedures as scientists.
Yeah, to give it that kind of status, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea that as soon as you call somebody a scientist, particularly if they're happening to be wearing a white coat, people sit up and listen to what they say. And I think positivism, it wanted to be a science of society. You know, I think Durkheim wanted to uncover social problems and find solutions to them in the same way that early scientists, you know, wanted to find ways of preventing diseases and things like that.
Yeah. And just for clarification as well, because some students may have picked up on this, in some textbooks or some YouTube videos, for example, it uses the word structuralism as opposed to positivism. What's your advice for students if they come across the word structuralism?
I would say that structuralism probably belongs more with Marxism and functionalism. So I think maybe it's useful for students to separate methodology and theory, if that's possible. So structuralist theories would be Marxism and functionalism, but the methods they would use would be positivist methods. So I think that would be the way that I would try to separate it for students.
Yeah. So if we were to simplify, if any students who are learning at a lower level or finding some of this a little bit too difficult, if we were to put it into its simplest form, positivists are more likely to use quantitative data and take a macro approach. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough.
Yeah. And as you said, I think some of the main methods we're talking about, statistics, surveys, maybe some forms of questionnaire.
Yeah, I mean, I think questionnaires, especially self-completion questionnaires, tick virtually all the boxes for positivists, because if they used more of an interview method, then subjectivity might creep in. And, you know, one of the really important things for positivists is objectivity. So the more distant they can remain from the subjects, the better the research is in terms of being objective.
Great. Thank you, Circe. Well, that concludes our discussion about positivism and positivist methods. Let's take a quick break, and in part 2, we'll learn all about interpretivism. So let's move on to interpretivism then. So if we know that early sociology and the founding fathers preferred this positivist approach, when did we start to see the opposite? When did interpretivism start to become popular?
I'm not entirely sure. I would probably say sometime around the 1960s, but yeah. I feel like Weber was around before then though, right?
Yeah, I agree with you, because the ideas of Max Weber are often linked to the start of interpretivism, but in terms of actually becoming popular, it seems to be the 60s and 70s, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's, the macro theories were very strong for a long time. It's not a surprise that it's the 60s, because lots of things changed then. Lots of alternative views were being brought out. So I suppose in sociology too, I guess that's the case.
And so what was it about Weber's work which kind of turned sociology on its head? What were his main differences in relation to interpretivism compared to positivism?
For Weber, it was completely the other way around, that society is shaped by humans. Human beings have different ways of interpreting the world. We can apply different meanings to the same situation. So I think it's the difference between kind of cause and action. For Weber and social action theorists, we are the people that are actively shaping society.
Yeah, and it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, to study whole groups of people and say that's how they all behave, to say, for example, that's how men behave or that's how women behave. That's rather stereotyping and a little not quite getting into the individual behaviours, is it?
No, and I mean, I suppose it's both methodologies choose methods which reflect their own views, don't they? So there's nothing wrong with statistics. I don't think we can dismiss statistics, but as you say, statistics are a very broad look at behaviour. If we want to know what's going on inside people's heads and what motivates them, let's say to commit crime, for example, you need to get a little bit more closer to them. You need to get inside their heads.
Yeah, so taking that more micro approach. So what would be classic interpretivist research methods, would you say?
I mean, I would say interpretivist most favourite research method must be participant observation, and probably the covert variety. So studying people in their natural environment without their knowledge, because it's really only this method that can help sociologists get behind the way that we behave in certain situations. Sometimes that type of method is too dangerous. Sometimes that type of method maybe is too unethical. But if they had their choice of method, it would be participant observation.
And as you said, sometimes that's not doable. So what other methods might they turn to? The unstructured interview, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I see the unstructured interview as a kind of compromise. It allows the person being interviewed to talk in detail. It tries to create rapport, which is very important for interpretivists. And most particularly, it's when the topic cannot be studied through observational research. And I suppose the best example of that is the Dobash and Dobash research into domestic violence. That just wouldn't be possible for a sociologist to do through participant observation.
Yeah. And likewise, there's quite a few subject areas that sociologists want to look at where statistics just wouldn't do, would it? You actually need to get in depth and empathetic with the person that you're researching.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, a really good example, I know it's a bit of an old example now, and actually in the light of Black Lives Matter and things like that, I don't know how Griffin would be viewed, but I would still see his research where he dyed his skin black to understand racism in US society as a really good example of that type of research. He couldn't interview African Americans as a white man. He couldn't really understand what it was like to be the victim of racism. So he actually put himself in their place.
Yeah, and some students might have seen this word, but we often refer to ethnographic research, don't we, where the researcher really throws themselves in through living the life of the people that they're actually researching.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's this whole idea of what Weber calls Verstehen, isn't it? You know, not just understanding, but empathetic understanding. And the best way to be able to empathize with people is to put yourself in their shoes. I mean, you know, as we said, it can be very dangerous. It can be very time consuming, but it is the research which is most valid, I think, and really brings out the meanings that people assign to their situations.
Yeah. And you just mentioned the word valid. As you just said, I think that this is of real importance. So if positivists are looking for reliable data, if interpretivists are looking for more valid data, what does that mean in simple terms?
Valid data is data which is true for those people that are being studied. I mean, I know students get sometimes confused with valid and reliable, sometimes even see them as interchangeable. I think it's tricky because normally if something's reliable, we can trust it. Whereas in research methods, if something is valid, we can trust it. Valid data which really, truly represents the people that are being studied.
Yeah, so I always say to students, forget what you previously think the word reliable means, because in sociology, it can mean something quite different, certainly.
Yeah, and often those two are quite mutually exclusive. It's not always the case, but often the case that the most valid research is very unreliable. It's completely spontaneous. It isn't replicable. And the extremely reliable data, particularly from surveys, is actually not very valid.
Yeah. And I often find as well students become a little bit obsessed with whether a sociologist was a positivist or interpretivist, but actually a lot of contemporary researchers use a combination of methods, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we teach it, we have to almost teach it in that very extreme way because it's easier for students to understand. But most research contains a range of different methods. And I think, as I said before, there's nothing wrong with a survey. You know, a survey is a good place to start. But usually really good research will then include some more qualitative methods as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at many modern day research, it often starts, like you said, with a survey or some background statistics before building on top of that with the more in-depth research, whether that's an interview or an observation, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Caroline Jackson, isn't it, who studied the lads and the ladettes in the classroom. And I think she started with surveys and then she selected some of the students that she thought were particularly interesting and interviewed them in a more in-depth way.
Thank you for mentioning that one, Circe, because there's an interview with Caroline Jackson. So if you want to listen to that one, have a look back through. It's in the back catalogue somewhere. Diane Ray as well, Diane Ray's miseducation study. She used a combination of methods, starting with statistics and going on to interviews as well. So students should get used to the fact that many researchers do combine those methods. And just for clarification, what do we call that, where they're combining the methods together?
Triangulation? Sometimes it could be methodological pluralism, can't it?
Yeah, that's what I was going to check, because I've looked at, some textbooks say triangulation, some say methodological pluralism. As an examiner, are you happy for students to use either?
I am happy, but I have to say, and maybe this is a bit harsh, what I find not a particularly great statement that students might make is just a final paragraph where they say, of course, most researchers would use triangulation, because that in itself isn't particularly meaningful. I think to make the most of that, you would have to explain why, and how, the validity is great. But on the other hand, it's good to have some reliable data as well.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cop-out to do that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Would you give any other final advice for students that are perhaps struggling with positivism and interpretivism? Because it can go quite detailed. What advice would you give for the very basics for students to be able to understand what it means?
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think for positivism, it's about structure. And I think positivism these days tends to get quite a bad press, maybe. It's viewed as being a little bit cold. And, you know, as we said, some of the functionalist research is really dated. But I think if you look around you, there are structures. You know, if you look at statistical data, people's lives are structured. There are patterns, even if we think that there's something else going on beyond them. You only have to look at educational statistical data about the impact of things like poverty on achievement to see that there are structures in society. And I think with interpretivism, which I think a lot of students tend to feel slightly warmer to because it feels like a warmer type of a theory, it's really about getting to know people, being able to see inside somebody's head. And, you know, it's a very insightful type of research. I mean, I would say sometimes I would use the kind of UCAS application as a good example, whereby the, you know, predicted grades and the previous GCSE results, that's your kind of positivist part. Universities will use that to compare with other students. The personal statement is the qualitative data where you are kind of inviting the admissions tutor to sort of see inside your head and see what's going on for you.
Yeah, and you can totally understand why students connect with that one a little bit more. You know, if you were doing your own research and you could either do statistics and surveys or a covert observation, one sounds a little bit more sexy than the others, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it partly depends what other subjects a student is doing. Yeah. And actually where they're from, often the Chinese students really like positivism and they think that society is structured. Society does determine their behaviour. Let's face it, it probably does. Whereas students from other backgrounds, maybe Eastern European students, tend to be more sympathetic to interpretivism. So I suppose it does depend on the student a little bit as well, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose it depends if you're more of a science/maths person or more theoretical. I guess that could influence where you sway on which side of the argument as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose generally speaking, science and math students don't tend to do sociology.
That's true.
I mean, sometimes, but yeah, sociology students on the whole, I think, are more sympathetic to interpretivism.
Great. And I've got one final question from you from Sam. Sam hasn't given their surname, so I don't actually know if Sam's male or female, but that doesn't matter. So Sam asked, they've just been learning about positivism and interpretivism, and then they said, but what about postmodernism? Where does that fit?
Postmodernism and research, I think if you had to put them in a camp, they would definitely be in the interpretivist camp. However, I think postmodernists believe everything is relative, don't they? So the purpose of research is almost just to observe in a personal way what's going on around you. One person's understanding of the world is no better than another person's understanding of the world. I think it's very difficult to put postmodernists in a theoretical box. I guess that's kind of the point of them, isn't it?
Yeah, I kind of agree. I tend to try and teach positivism and interpretivism and then postmodernism, because I think you're right that if they were to fit anywhere, they'd be more likely to be interpretivist, but I don't think you can pigeonhole them as neatly as that.
No, I mean, it's postmodernism is a kind of a theory that deconstructs and criticises other theories. And I don't think they would want to be put into a methodological box. I imagine that they might just say you can use any research methods, whichever ones happen to fit that particular topic. Because I'm sure when they're studying things like media, you know, they would look at different media images. That might even involve some quantitative analysis, possibly.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, I think, as you just said, a lot of postmodernists would use a combination of methods, that kind of triangulation, methodological pluralism that we mentioned. But that's a good question, that, Sam. You could think of it as a separate discipline, actually.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not just saying this as a kind of cop-out. I don't think in the exam you would be expected in an essay on interpretivism or positivism to put too much about what postmodernists think in terms of methodology. I think for the purposes of keeping it nice and clear, You've got, your interactionists who like to use interpretivist methods. It's all about meaning. It's all about action. And you've got your Marxists and your functionalists who like to use quantitative positivist methods because they see society as shaping behaviour.
Brilliant. I think that's a nice little conclusion to round up there, Circe. Really appreciate your help and answering those questions. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.